Ellen, welcome.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. So a very quick introduction. Ellen Alvord, she's at Mount Holyoke College Art Museum, and she's the Associate Director for Engagement, and she's also the Curator of Academic Programs there. And what Ellen very kindly agreed to do today is, so today we were going to discuss three artists. We were going to look at Diane Arbus, and then we were going to look at two contemporary Chinese artists together with Professor Li. One of them was Liu Zhang, and the other one was Ouyang Xingkai. But, instead Ellen stepped in, and we are going to look at one of the photographs that Ellen is very familiar with. She has taught it several times by the Chinese artist Ouyang Xingkai. And I think without taking further time for me, Ellen, I know you have to leave. You have another meeting at 4. I'm just going to pass the baton on to you. One thing I want to tell the class, so the photograph that Ellen and I are going to talk about, Ellen is going to walk us through. But I think initially we're going to look at Ellen's screen together, right? Is that right?
That's right. So okay. I'm going to share that now.
So, okay, Ellen, let me down. Give it over to you.
This image, interestingly, is something that we have two versions of this photograph. One is smaller size, around maybe 24 by 14 kind of size, and then this one that we're looking at is actually almost life size. The figures are this is blown up to a very large size, so that the two figures you see here are comparable to human size. So I'd love to just open up with just a few initial thoughts about what you notice about this photograph, and maybe kind of walk us through a visual inventory of what we're able to see in this picture.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing maybe a pantry of some sort, or maybe they're in some room of their house that seems close to the kitchen, because it seems like there's like spices, like table.
Right, so this back wall here.
Yeah.
And the table that's behind them. Great, and
yeah.
I think I can zoom in a little bit if that helps. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great, so you're saying maybe some kind of kitchen space. Anything else that would kind of go along with that idea? Or a different idea? Yeah.
Two things that I noticed was that they both have their hands on top of, it seems like, a book. That they're like holding each other's hands over a book. And also something that, I don't know if it even was supposed to jump out at me, but the back wall above those hanging tied bags, it looks as if there's this colorful horses, maybe like a decoration. And that's kind of really the only thing in the painting, the only thing in the photograph that I see that has more bright, vivid colors, as opposed to kind of this muted brown that you're seeing throughout.
Great, I love that you're picking up on the colors in the image. And so are you talking about this upper right corner here?
Yeah, yep, exactly.
Okay, great. And you're noticing, what kind of colors are you noticing in here?
Well, the greens and yellows almost, I don't know if it's horses or something, or animals on a grassy floral field, something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's very hard to see in this image, but I think you can see the horse's legs down here and the fronts of the different horses. This one is a white color. Does everybody see that?
Yeah. With
the mane flying. And can you tell, like, what is it? Is that Kayla who is speaking? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm not sure if I could answer that actually, but I'm zooming in on the large image that we were sent, and it looks like there's almost like name tags on it underneath or something. I'm not sure if it's a painting or a poster, or I'm not too sure actually.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So there are these white rectangles, and we can come back to that. If you count them, you'll actually find how many.
I wasn't gonna say anything about the name tags, but something I noticed when you zoom in on the really high resolution image that we got sent, it looks like the people on the horses are wearing uniforms, almost like soldiers. So that could be, it could be like an army or a position, and that could do with the name tags.
So that's great. So for those of you who are just looking on the screen here, you can see the heads right across the top here. And I think you're right. It looks like they're wearing uniforms and maybe caps that go with those uniforms, right? So some kind of military figures. That's a great point.
It's interesting that to juxtapose that print with the newspaper that's right next to it as well, because it looks like the newspaper has been attached horizontally, like maybe to cover up a crack in the wall instead of to like serve as a feature on the wall itself.
Right. I love this that you're pointing out. So the newspaper that appears to be the left of that image doesn't, looks like it's maybe covering something up as opposed to actual decoration. And on top of that, we've got, this framed image of these military figures on horseback. And then can you make out what's over here on the left? I think you're right. It doesn't look like the newspaper's oriented.
I think those might be family portraits. It looks like there are like a few people who are posing. It's very hard, even on the high resolution image, it's pretty hard to tell what's in that next framed thing.
Could it be a mirror?
Could it be, what was the question?
A mirror.
A mirror. Yeah, that's a good idea because there is a reflective quality, but I think it just might be the fact that this is the surface of a photograph. But if you look really closely, there seem to be individual images or rectangles within this frame. Does everybody see that? And I don't know if you're able to look at your high-res image. It's very hard to make it out, but when you see it in person, it looks like photographs that are kind of montaged together in a larger black frame. So maybe more evidence that maybe this is some kind of domestic interior. We were talking about maybe a kitchen. How about some of the other objects that you see in here?
Both figures are wearing sort of slides or flip-flops, but they're different different styles, I guess. For the man, they look more worn, and I guess the girl is wearing what would be considered like a typically like girly color with sort of like shiny pink, I don't know what you would call the straps.
Yeah, there's sort of that sort of kind of glossy pearlescent pink, almost like plastic jelly shoes. I think that's a great detail that you're noticing their shoes. How about the figures themselves?
I noticed when I zoomed in on their faces that it looks like the little girl is looking at the face of the old man, but it doesn't look like his gaze is on her. He's like looking past her or to the side of her. It's harder to tell because you can't see his pupils. And also, I couldn't help but feel like there's tension between the two figures because he's holding her wrist, but she's not really holding him back.
Okay, these are all great details. So noticing how they're interacting with each other, the fact that she seems to be gazing directly at his face, whereas he seems to maybe not be looking directly at her, but maybe past her. And this idea that he has his hand on her hand, but she is not holding his hand in return. So those are great details. What kinds of expressions do you read on their faces? What do you think they're feeling?
She seems to me like a little bit on edge. And he seems much more at ease. And there's something about like holding the wrist that seems to me almost like he might be taking her pulse or something, which then makes me reflect on some of these like canisters in the background and stuff as maybe like medicinal or something.
Okay, great. And so what, can you keep going with a few more details of what you think might be happening here?
There is this element, oh, sorry, if you want John to answer.
Go ahead, Kayla.
It's funny, just the mention of how he's not staring directly at her and how he is touching her in a way that, I don't know, it made me kind of question if he is blind or doesn't have proper sight, just because of that, the way he's staring off. I mean, that could be completely wrong, but it just led me to kind of question if he is able to see clearly.
I think that's a great point. We really can't have much access, right, to his eyes here. This idea of, is he able to see her, and, what is he thinking right here? I think just as we zoom into these expressions, does anyone else want to take a guess at what they're feeling and what these expressions are saying?
My first impression was that it's like a grandfather and a granddaughter. And I think the look on her face shows that she, like, I feel like often when you're a young kid, you are almost afraid of your elders in an attempt to respect them. And so I feel like she's like kind of sitting quietly and patiently waiting for him to maybe say something. I think that he has a bit of a smile on his face, maybe like as if he's providing consolation, especially in like the way his hand is placed on her wrist.
Yeah, I think the fact that his hand is on top and she's sort of looking up at him a little bit, and it sort of helps when you look at the way the light is coming in. It sort of places the girl at like this a slight diagonal, like looking into the light, looking at, I guess, this other figure. She definitely seems to be like looking up at him, both emotionally and literally.
Oh, I think that's beautiful. It sort of draws our attention to this kind of diagonal between the two figures, and kind of draws our eye up to where the light is coming from here, as it kind of cascades down over his head and onto the front of her. It's also interesting. So I love what you're talking about, sort of both the physical and the emotional quality of how she's looking up to him, both, as you said, as an elder and literally. Other interpretations or thoughts about what's happening here?
There's also, the more I look at the photograph, seeing this, the older man and how he's in black, and he feels more at home in this image, just because of the color tone of his skin and his clothes and the background. And it seems like this young girl almost looks like she's out of time in a sense, just because she does have these bright colors that are more muted in the background as opposed to her and what she's wearing. And it almost seems like she's entering his world in a sense, because everything does seem to be a little bit older.
I think those are great observations. Yeah, I mean, we can start to collect what are the things that look older, besides him.
And then I think Mackenzie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I got the impression that there is disciplining happening with the like grab on the wrist and being like on top of a book. It reminds me of like the solemnness of, like, when I think of like a hand on the book, I think of swearing in the president and kind of like an oath of truth. So that just made me think that they're like conducting some type of like ceremony within themselves. I don't know.
I love that, connecting to this idea of traditions and rituals, and this idea of having their hands on top of a book. Other interpretations of this, or even details that we haven't talked about?
What's in the jars on the shelves?
Yeah, somebody want to just even describe, maybe somebody could describe what you're seeing on these shelves.
It looks like canisters that they each have a label, and each canister also has some sort of floral design on it, or maybe not floral, but I've initially thought that they were canisters of tea.
That makes sense. There's something uniform about them, right, in terms of size and shape. And I love what you're saying. We really, maybe there's a sense of the floral here. But at the same time, does everybody see these rectangles?
Yeah.
So maybe it almost feels like there are labels on here. And then if you look really closely, there are a few that are a little bit different, like this one. Right, the lid, there's a lid and it's a slightly different shape. And then there's this one. And then this one over here in the upper right. So what does that remind people of?
Kind of looks like medicine or something, or?
Yeah, medicine. It kind of reminds me of those vitamin bottles,
Right, yeah.
right? With the little teal color label. And then notice this. right behind his head. Can anybody see what that is?
Is that
Either, oh,
I was gonna say that looks like a mortar and pestle that you use to like mash things.
Yeah, so it seems to be a bowl shape, whoops, and also something coming out of it on the right, so maybe a mortar and pestle. Great. And then above that, we had somebody mentioned these bags hanging from the wall. Does anybody have a sense of what might be the contents of these bags?
I almost wonder if it's like roots or bark of some sort. I remember the word I was trying to think about earlier, apothecary. It seems like I know at least in Chinatown in Boston, there are people who run sort of shops like this where they have like, I guess, natural remedies, including like plants and herbs, but also sometimes like dead animals and different animal skins. And it almost looks like, I can't really tell what's hanging out of that that bag that's right above the man's head, but it looks like it could be something sort of reptilian almost.
Yeah, there's something actually hanging out of this one bag. But yes, it kind of feels like maybe natural elements that are coming, botanicals, as you were saying, roots. Somebody else had their hand up.
Eva.
Yeah, I did. I also saw it as more of like an apothecary, but I think it also has more of like a lived-in feel rather than like a traditional shop that would hold like a lot of medicinal medicines and tools, especially just with like the very worn like leather couch that he's sitting on. It just definitely seems like this is a home and a place of work. And I also, to add on to Nathan's point, like in a lot of like traditional apothecaries, like to give their supplies, they usually do keep them in like plastic bags that are easy to like take from the shop to their homes. So I think like that could be maybe what those like things hanging above like the poster of the horses are, and then with like the little jars of everything else. But to the left, I don't really know why there's more, seems like items that you could find in their home, it seems like, rather than like at a shop. If that makes sense.
Right. So this sort of mixture of things that you might find in an apothecary, but also the sense of a home. And in fact, I don't know if anybody noticed this detail right to the right of the girl's, kind of above her hand that's on her knee. Did you see this? Zoom in. Was anybody able to identify these objects here?
a couple of forks.
Looks like a couple of forks, yeah. And then zooming on this side, so I seem to having trouble a little bit. Is anybody able to identify what's in the background on this side?
So Elizabeth, Ellen is showing us the very, very left of the image. Ellen, one of the students is joining through telephone, but she has the image, so.
Okay, great, yes, in the lower left corner. It's amazing how, even though this is a high res image, it's amazing how difficult it is to see the detail. And when you're in person, even though it's quite dark in person as well, when you get up close, you really can make out more of these details. And I think what you see on the bottom right is a bag of rice. And like you said, these other elements, like these boxes on the left side, middle section of the image, as well as these other kind of containers. And curious things behind their hands, right? Little boxes, open pamphlets or books. This round object here. So it's a very interesting kind of hybrid kind of space, right? And then going back to the figures, we had a lot of different interpretations of what they might be doing in this space. Maybe it's a grandfather and a granddaughter. Maybe it's this person's home, the gentleman's home. Somebody also mentioned this idea that maybe he was taking her pulse. And I kind of wanted to revisit that idea. Who was the person who was talking about that? So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why you felt like the older man was taking the girl's pulse.
It just actually makes me think of I have been to see several times like an acupuncturist, and she took my pulse each time in this way that was like very like loving as opposed to like medical. And this pose just strikes me as kind of like a gentle way where there's like a couple of primary fingers or sort of like holding that part of the wrist.
Wow, I really appreciate how you describe that, because this is a very different environment, right, than the way we think of a Western medical office. And this gentleness and the lovingness that you were talking about that he seems to have towards the way he's caring for her is really interesting. And I think the other thing that's interesting is we are pretty sure that he's taking her pulse, because the description that we're given in the title of this image refers to him as a Chinese medical practitioner. And it would make sense, right, that if he's taking her pulse, that he might not be looking directly at her and instead would be concentrating and perhaps, looking past her as he's trying to read her pulse. So I think that's really beautiful how you described it. And it's also interesting that you had some experience with this. And one of the things I think that's so interesting about this photograph is that while we can really look at these details and come up with the same ideas about what we're seeing in terms of his gaze and in terms of maybe the tension that we see in her and the fact that she's holding her knee, the fact that he looks more relaxed, we can still have different interpretations of what's happening between these two people. This idea that a grandfather could be either consoling or in some way reprimanding the younger girl, because we see a little bit of tension in her face and maybe uncertainty. But then when you think about the fact that he could actually be giving her medical care, that could explain why she also has apprehension, right? That she doesn't know what he's going to read and what he's going to, diagnose her potentially. So I think this is one of these images that's so interesting for the ways in which a photograph can capture so much rich visual information, yet bring us to different places in terms of how we read what's happening. The photographer, Ouyang Xingkai, is Chinese, and he had this 7-year project where he was photographing this one particular village that had been a very bustling port on a waterway, a tributary of the Yangtze River. And over the years, what happened is that it kind of got left behind as the railway and roadways became more common forms of transportation. A lot of the merchant class moved away from this town, and there's sort of this sense of the place being kind of a shadow of what it used to be. And even this room, which seems very worn down, and notice the couch seems old, actually was a fairly wealthy, what they refer to as a cellar house. And we can see when we look at the window that this is actually underground. So on the right side of the image, I think everything from the bottom of the windowsill down is underground. And then that's why we see this, sharp angle of light coming down from the right side of the image. And this photographer really wanted to document some of the older people in this village and the traditional ways of life that they had living here. So that's just a little background on this image. And I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts or comments. Knowing that background, does that change how you see this image?
In a way, it's a very deliberately anti-modern picture, right? It shows a time before modernity came, in a way. So somehow the oldness, the shards of glass in the upper right, or the, you know, the worn out arm of the couch on which he's sitting, you know, very many of these details are just contributing to that broader theme of its pastness in a way, right? Of a time before the present.
Yeah, it's and a little bit more of the background of these photographs, which I hope someday you can come and see in person, is that the artist came to the United States for the first time when this and 3 other photographs were in an exhibition at the museum. And he was so pleased to have them at a teaching museum that he gifted the 4 large format images to the museum. And when you see them in person, because he's blown them up so much, there's almost a slight pixelation to the images, and this softness that almost kind of feels like a painting as opposed to a photograph. So they're really incredible images. But I think you're right. He captures this old way of life, and it's interesting to have, you know, her wearing more modern clothing, the almost Hello Kitty type shoes that she's wearing. And I loved the student who was talking about how she adds this kind of newness and youth in this image that really sort of documents another era of time.
I have a question. Do you know how he took these photographs? If it was with like a film or digital camera, like a large format camera or not? Because you were talking about the pixelation, or is that
Yeah,
like, an optical effect of the lens?
I think that this is a large format camera that he digitizes the image from. But I can check on that. I've been looking for, we actually have a statement by the artist about this series, but because I'm no longer able to get to my office, I wasn't able to get the catalog, but I will get a scan of those, that artist statement and send it to your professor so she can share that with you. But I think that's a great question. I think it's a regular, it's not a digital camera, but I'll double check on that. Is there anybody who's traveled to Asia in this, or to China in this class?
I have.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are seeing this image, having actually traveled.
It makes me think a lot about how multi-generational living is so much more common there than it is in most other parts of the world. It sort of seems like this is more, it's a more quotidian scene than it would be if it had been totally like, if the same picture were taken in like American culture, I guess. Like, it makes me immediately think there's a family relationship dynamic in this rather than sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point. I think a lot of the images from the series capture that intergenerational quality. So I think that's just such a great point. As we've had students who are from East Asia look at this image, they've slowly given us a lot of additional information because they recognize things in the image, which I think is amazing. So this idea of the pictures within a larger frame, this sort of montage of pictures, this is just something that apparently is very common. And if you could see this up close, you'd see that it looks like people who are like dressed in similar clothing, like with white light colored tops and dark bottoms, maybe even like school uniforms. And this poster up here, we've been told, is a depiction of Mao's 10 generals. And we think that it's actually a calendar because I was talking about how many little white rectangles are right here, and there are 10 of them, and it looks like 2 are missing. So potentially it's a calendar. Over here, some of these boxes have been identified. This one on you see the 3 box, the yellow one, and then these 2 that have white backgrounds underneath. The one on the right that has kind of that scoop style design is actually a brand of powdered milk apparently, that came onto the Chinese market in the year 2000. So a student who was looking at this, was able to identify that this image must have been taken after the year 2000. And in fact, it was taken, I think, in 2009, and I think was printed in 2011. So very, very interesting how these details, like over time, have been revealed to us by people who actually have experience. And also most students who are from East Asia right away have that understanding that he is a Chinese medical practitioner. They kind of recognize, as many of you did, the herbs and the medicinals and the fact that he's taking her pulse. So that's another really, again, cross-cultural, I think that kind of interesting, bringing that kind of cultural information and background with us when we look at something, and how we might have different assumptions that we bring to an image based on our cultural backgrounds. And I found the photo of that box of milk, so I'm going to share that with you. You can share it with the students. So, well, maybe hand it back to you if there's any other questions or comments you want to talk about this image.
Let me unmute myself, yes. I was just saying to myself here, after our break, I'm going to reveal some more information about this that you shared with me earlier, Ellen, with the students. And then, yes, I'll get their feedback once they have that further background information as well. But is there anyone who wants to ask or say anything else to Ellen before we thank her and let her go to her next meeting?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Is there any reason why you chose this image in particular out of the set?
Well, from my experience, we've really, this has been a really interesting image to use because of the fact that we know who is in the image, and there's so many different interpretations. Again, you can see this as just a grandfather telling some kind of news to a granddaughter, or you can see this as, again, someone who's giving medical care, and that often is very much connected to your background and if you've had any experience with that. So this is an image we actually use all the time with intro biology classes. We do an observation lab, and there's just so much rich visual detail in this image. So the idea of being able to really take a visual inventory, this is a great image for that. But then also this idea of the multiplicity of interpretations that you can have from it. So there are other great images from this same series, but this is just a particular favorite of ours that we use a lot in teaching.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for brightening my day. This was a lot more fun than any of my meetings. So thank you for letting me join you. And good luck with your remote classes, and sending good wishes to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.